What secrets lie buried in the minds of those who served history's most notorious figures? What truth emerges when the typewriters fall silent and loyalty gives way to memory? In the final days of World War II, as Adolf Hitler retreated into his underground bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin, a small circle of secretaries remained at his side, typing his letters, recording his thoughts, and witnessing the collapse of the Third Reich from the dictator's inner sanctum. When the war ended and Hitler was dead, these women emerged from the rubble carrying memories of a man the world knew only as a monster. What they revealed in the years that followed shocked a world desperate to understand how catastrophe had happened. These were not high-ranking officials or military strategists. They were young women who had taken secretarial positions in what they initially viewed as ordinary government work. Christa Schroeder, Johanna Wolf, Gerda Christian, and perhaps most famously Traudl Junge. These women spent years in Hitler's immediate presence, typing his correspondence, taking dictation for speeches, and observing the private man behind the public persona. Their accounts, emerging gradually in the post-war decades, provided unprecedented glimpses into Hitler's daily life, his personality quirks, his final days, and the surreal atmosphere of devoted service to a man orchestrating genocide. What shocked the world was not just what these secretaries revealed about Hitler himself, the banality of his routines, his vegetarianism, his fondness for dogs, but what their testimonies exposed about complicity, willful ignorance, and the psychological mechanisms that allowed ordinary people to serve evil without recognizing it as such. Their revelations forced uncomfortable questions. How could intelligent women work so closely with Hitler and claim not to know about the Holocaust? What does it mean to be both victim and perpetrator, to be manipulated by ideology while simultaneously enabling atrocity? And perhaps most disturbingly, what do their stories reveal about the human capacity for compartmentalization and denial? This is the story of what Hitler's secretaries saw, what they chose to reveal, and why their testimonies continue to disturb and fascinate decades after the war's end. To understand the significance of the secretaries' revelations, one must first grasp their unique position within the Nazi hierarchy and the specific historical moment in which they served. Hitler's secretaries occupied an unusual space, close enough to witness the dictator's daily life, yet distant enough from decision-making processes to maintain plausible deniability about the regime's crimes. This peculiar position would shape both their wartime experiences and their post-war testimonies. The role of personal secretary to Hitler was not simply administrative. These women became part of Hitler's inner circle, a small group that included his military adjutants, personal physicians, valets, and closest political associates. They worked in shifts, ensuring someone was always available when Hitler needed to dictate letters, speeches, or directives. They accompanied him to various headquarters, the Berghof in the Bavarian Alps, the Wolf's Lair in East Prussia, and finally the Führer bunker in Berlin. They took meals with him, participated in late-night tea sessions where Hitler would monologue for hours, and witnessed his moods, rages, and increasingly erratic behavior as the war turned against Germany. The most prominent of Hitler's secretaries during the war years were four women whose accounts would later provide crucial historical evidence. Johanna Wolf had worked for Hitler since 1929, making her the longest-serving secretary with deep knowledge of the Nazi movement's rise to power. Christa Schroeder joined in 1933 and served throughout the war, later writing a memoir that provided detailed observations of Hitler's personality and habits. Gerda Christian, née Daranovsky, married one of Hitler's military adjutants and remained in the bunker until nearly the end. Traudl Junge, the youngest, joined Hitler's staff in 1942 at age 22 and became perhaps the most famous secretary through her post-war interviews and the film Downfall, which was partly based on her testimony. These women came to their positions through various paths, but certain patterns emerged. Most were young, in their 20s or early 30s when hired. They came from middle-class backgrounds and had received training in shorthand and typing, the essential secretarial skills of the era. None had particularly strong political backgrounds or ideological commitments to Nazism when initially hired, though they certainly held the nationalist sentiments common among their generation of Germans. They were selected partly for their skills, but also for their personalities. Hitler preferred young, attractive women who were pleasant, discreet, and ideologically malleable. The working conditions in Hitler's inner circle were both privileged and psychologically demanding. The secretaries enjoyed material comforts unavailable to most Germans: good food, comfortable accommodations, access to amenities, even as the war devastated Germany. They were protected from direct exposure to warfare's horrors, living in fortified headquarters or mountain retreats. Yet they also endured Hitler's nocturnal schedule. He often slept late into the day and worked through the night, requiring his staff to adapt to his rhythms. They experienced the claustrophobia of underground bunkers, the tension of military defeats, and the increasingly paranoid atmosphere as Hitler's mental state deteriorated. The historical context of their service spanned the period of Nazi Germany's greatest triumphs and ultimate collapse. Secretaries like Schroeder witnessed the euphoria following the conquest of France, the confidence of 1940 when Hitler seemed invincible. They were present for the decision to invade the Soviet Union, heard discussions of military strategy, and observed Hitler's reactions to setbacks. By 1945, they witnessed the physical and psychological disintegration of a man and a regime in its death throes. The nature of their work involved significant access to information. They typed correspondence with military commanders, foreign leaders, and party officials. They handled documents related to military operations, though typically not the most sensitive materials related to the Holocaust and other crimes. This selective access would later become crucial to understanding both what they knew and what they could credibly claim not to know. The social dynamics within Hitler's headquarters created a peculiar bubble isolated from external reality. Hitler cultivated a paternalistic relationship with his secretaries, treating them with courtesy, inquiring about their welfare, and creating an atmosphere of intimate domesticity, even amid World War. This personal kindness toward his immediate circle, a kindness that extended to solicitude about their health, interest in their families, and gifts on special occasions, created powerful psychological bonds that made it difficult for the secretaries to reconcile the caring employer they knew with the architect of genocide. That history records. The gender dynamics of their position also merit attention. As women in a profoundly patriarchal regime, Hitler's secretaries occupied subordinate positions by design. They were not expected to have political opinions or to question orders. This gendered hierarchy would later complicate assessments of their responsibility. Were they victims of a system that denied women agency, or were they complicit in crimes they chose not to see? The answer, as their testimonies reveal, is complex and varies among individuals. The end of the war brought chaos and danger. As Soviet forces closed in on Berlin in April 1945, most of Hitler's staff remained in the bunker. They witnessed Hitler's marriage to Eva Braun, took dictation for his political testament, and were present when news of his suicide spread through the bunker. Some, like Junge and Christian, managed to escape Berlin in the confusion following Hitler's death. Others were captured by Soviet forces and spent years in detention before returning to Germany. The immediate post-war period placed these women in difficult positions. Allied authorities detained them for interrogation, seeking information about Hitler's final days and any knowledge they might have about Nazi crimes. The secretaries faced a world that had learned the full scope of the Holocaust and viewed anyone who had been close to Hitler with suspicion and hostility. They had to navigate between self-preservation, minimizing their knowledge and involvement to avoid prosecution, and the historical record that their testimonies could provide. The infrastructure supporting Hitler's headquarters was itself revealing of the regime's priorities and methods. The various command centers, where the secretaries worked, represented massive investments in security and comfort for the leadership, while ordinary Germans suffered deprivation. The Berghof featured luxurious accommodations, stunning mountain views, and elaborate security measures. The Wolf's Lair was a sprawling complex of bunkers and buildings hidden in forests designed to withstand aerial attack. The Führer bunker in Berlin, constructed beneath the Reich Chancellery Garden, represented the ultimate refuge, a concrete fortress that nevertheless could not protect Hitler from the consequences of his decisions. The secretaries' daily routines varied depending on location and the war's progress. In the early war years at the Berghof, life retained some normalcy. Outdoor walks, film screenings, social gatherings. As the war intensified and headquarters moved to more fortified locations, life became more regimented and claustrophobic. In the bunker's final weeks, routines broke down entirely as reality intruded on the carefully maintained illusion of normalcy. The information ecosystem in which the secretaries operated was carefully controlled. Nazi propaganda saturated German media, while news of military setbacks was minimized or spun as temporary reversals. Information about the Holocaust was compartmentalized. Most Germans knew of Jewish persecution, but the systematic murder in death camps remained officially secret. The secretaries, despite their proximity to power, received information through these same filtered channels, supplemented by whatever they might overhear or intuit from their work. The psychological selection and conditioning of the secretarial staff deserves attention. Hitler and his staff sought women who would be personally loyal, discreet, and politically reliable. The secretaries underwent vetting to ensure no Jewish ancestry or politically suspect backgrounds. Once hired, they were incorporated into a system that rewarded loyalty and punished dissent. The combination of material comfort, proximity to power, and social pressure to conform created powerful incentives to suppress doubts and avoid asking difficult questions. The secretaries' relationships with Hitler and their experiences in his service varied significantly, shaped by personality, length of service, and individual moral frameworks. Understanding each woman's particular story reveals the complexity of complicity and the various ways individuals rationalize their proximity to evil. Traudl Junge emerged as the most publicly prominent of Hitler's secretaries, largely because she lived long enough to participate in extensive interviews and collaborate on projects that brought her story to wide audiences. Born in 1920, she was just 22 when she began working for Hitler in 1942, selected from a pool of candidates after a typing test and brief interview. She later described being flattered by the attention, excited by the prospect of important work, and completely naive about the regime she was serving. Junge's youth and relatively late entry into Hitler's service became central to her post-war narrative. She had not witnessed the Nazi movement's rise or the early persecution of Jews. She began her work when Germany was still winning victories on the Eastern Front, before the war's horrors became undeniable even in the protected bubble of Hitler's headquarters. This timing allowed her to construct a narrative of ignorance. She claimed not to have known about concentration camps or the systematic murder of Jews until after the war ended. In her final days with Hitler, Junge took dictation for his political testament and personal will. She was among the last to see him alive, typing documents that blamed Jews for the war, even as Hitler prepared for suicide. After his death, she escaped the bunker with a group that included Hitler's pilot and others from the inner circle. She was briefly detained by Soviet forces, released and eventually settled in West Germany under a different name. For decades, Junge remained largely silent about her experiences. When she did speak, she emphasized her youth, her ignorance, and her personal experience of Hitler as a polite, often kindly employer. She described his vegetarianism, his love for his dog Blondie, his courtesy toward women, and the surreal atmosphere of life in the bunker. These mundane details shocked audiences expecting accounts of obvious monstrosity. Hitler emerged from her descriptions as disturbingly ordinary in his personal habits, challenging simplistic narratives about evil being always recognizable. The turning point in Junge's public reckoning came late in her life. In 2002, she participated in the documentary Blind Spot: Hitler's Secretary, giving extensive interviews about her experiences. What shocked viewers was not just her detailed memories of Hitler's final days, but her acknowledgement that her claims of ignorance rang hollow. She recounted a pivotal moment when she learned that Sophie Scholl, a resistance fighter executed in 1943, had been the same age as Junge. This realization shattered her defense that youth explained her ignorance. As she put it in the documentary, "I could have found out about everything. I was no exception, and in my mind being young is not an excuse." This late-life acknowledgement of moral failure shocked audiences because it came from someone who had spent decades defending herself. Junge's evolution from defensive self-justification to painful self-examination provided a rare example of genuine moral reckoning with complicity. Yet even this confession raised questions. Was it genuine moral growth, or merely a recognition that her earlier defenses were no longer tenable? Could decades of denial be genuinely overcome, or did her late-life statements simply reflect what she knew audiences wanted to hear? Junge's interviews revealed additional disturbing details about the bunker's final days. She described the bizarre wedding celebration for Hitler and Eva Braun, with champagne toasts and forced gaiety, even as Soviet artillery pounded the city above. She recounted typing Hitler's final testament, in which he blamed Jews for the war and urged Germans to continue fighting. She witnessed the aftermath of Hitler's suicide, the confusion and desperation among those left behind, and the chaotic escape attempts as the bunker's inhabitants scattered. Her descriptions of Eva Braun were particularly revealing. Junge portrayed Braun as determinedly cheerful, even in the bunker's grim atmosphere, organizing small parties, ensuring that Hitler's birthday was celebrated, maintaining routines that created illusions of normalcy. Braun's insistence on staying with Hitler to the end, her calm acceptance of approaching death, and her attempts to keep spirits up among the bunker's inhabitants presented a troubling picture of devotion that transcended reason. Christa Schroeder presented a different trajectory. Born in 1908, she was older than Junge when she began working for Hitler in 1933, just as he consolidated power. She served throughout the Nazi era and remained ideologically committed to Hitler long after the war. Her memoir, He Was My Chief, published in 1985, provided extensive detail about Hitler's daily life, but maintained a defensive posture about both Hitler and her own role. Schroeder's account was valuable for its detail. She described Hitler's vegetarianism as arising from health concerns rather than ethical conviction, his insomnia and nocturnal work habits, his preference for films, and his reactions to various military developments. She portrayed him as a demanding but generally considerate employer, someone who could be charming and who showed concern for his staff's welfare. These humanizing details disturbed readers who preferred to view Hitler as simply monstrous, rather than as a complex human capable of both personal kindness and ordering genocide. What shocked many about Schroeder's account was her persistent defensiveness. Even decades after the war, she portrayed Hitler sympathetically, emphasized his positive qualities, and minimized her awareness of his crimes. She claimed that the Holocaust was largely unknown to those in Hitler's immediate circle, that they worked in an information bubble where such horrors were successfully concealed. This claim strained credulity. How could someone so close to Hitler, typing his correspondence and witnessing his rages against Jews, truly have been ignorant of the final solution? Schroeder's steadfast loyalty to Hitler's memory, even when it meant social ostracism and criticism, revealed the depth of ideological commitment and psychological investment that prevented some of Hitler's associates from ever truly confronting what they had enabled. Her refusal to recant or apologize shocked those who expected moral evolution over time. She represented the disturbing reality that proximity to evil does not guarantee its recognition, that ideological commitment can override moral reasoning even in the face of overwhelming evidence. Schroeder's memoir contained revelations that inadvertently undermined her claims of ignorance. She described Hitler's anti-Semitic tirades, his crude jokes about Jews, his fury when military operations failed to advance quickly enough through areas with large Jewish populations. She recounted conversations where Hitler spoke of solving the Jewish question in ways that, even if not explicitly describing death camps, clearly indicated violent intentions. Her attempt to present these memories as innocuous revealed either remarkable self-deception or deliberate obfuscation. Gerda Christian, born Daranowski in 1913, joined Hitler's secretarial staff in 1937 and married Luftwaffe officer Eckhard Christian, one of Hitler's military adjutants, in 1943. She remained in the bunker until after Hitler's suicide and was among those who escaped Berlin. Christian gave fewer public interviews than Junge or Schroeder, maintaining a lower profile after the war. When she did speak, she provided valuable details about daily life in Hitler's headquarters, but maintained the position that she had been unaware of the extent of Nazi crimes. Christian's accounts focused on the domestic and personal aspects of life around Hitler. She described the tea sessions where Hitler would monologue about art, architecture, and his plans for post-war Germany. She recounted Eva Braun's attempts to create a semblance of normal social life, even in the bunker. She witnessed the psychological deterioration of Hitler in his final months, the trembling hands, the stooped posture, the paranoid rages. These observations provided historians with important details about Hitler's physical and mental decline, but did little to address her moral responsibility for serving him. Christian's position as wife of a military adjutant placed her in a somewhat different category from the other secretaries. Her husband's involvement in military planning meant she had access to discussions about military operations, though whether she paid attention or understood their implications remained disputed. Her marriage also created additional incentives to defend the regime. Acknowledging its criminality meant acknowledging her husband's complicity, a psychological burden many spouses found unbearable. Johanna Wolf represented the longest continuity with the Nazi movement, having worked for Hitler since 1929 in the party offices in Munich. She witnessed the movement's rise from fringe political party to totalitarian state. This extensive service meant she had seen more than any other secretary, yet she too maintained after the war that she had been unaware of the Holocaust's extent. Wolf gave few interviews and wrote no memoir, maintaining privacy until her death in 1985. Her silence itself became a form of testimony. What could she have revealed that she chose not to? Wolf's long service meant she had witnessed the early persecution of Jews, the boycotts, the Nuremberg laws, Kristallnacht. She had been present during the years when Nazi anti-Semitism escalated from discrimination to violence. Her claims of ignorance about the final solution, while perhaps technically defensible regarding specific death camp operations, could not extend to ignorance of the regime's murderous anti-Semitism. Her silence suggested either shame about what she had witnessed or calculation that detailed revelations would undermine her post-war reputation. The collective impact of these secretaries' revelations emerged gradually over decades. In the immediate post-war years, their testimonies focused on Hitler's final days, providing details for historians trying to establish the facts of his death. As time passed, and as the Holocaust became more thoroughly documented and publicly acknowledged, questions about the secretaries' knowledge and complicity intensified. How could they have not known? And if they did know, how could they have continued serving Hitler? Their answers to these questions shocked audiences in different ways. Some, like Junge eventually, acknowledged moral failure and expressed remorse. Others, like Schroeder, maintained defensive positions that seemed to reveal either genuine delusion or stubborn ideological commitment. Still others, like Wolf, simply refused to engage publicly with questions about their complicity. These varied responses demonstrated that there was no single template for how individuals processed their roles in enabling atrocity. What united their accounts was the emphasis on Hitler's personal charm and the psychological power he wielded over those close to him. They described a man who could be considerate and even gentle with his immediate staff while ordering mass murder. This dichotomy shocked audiences because it challenged simplistic notions of evil as always obvious and repellent. Hitler's secretaries revealed a disturbing truth. Monsters can be personally charming, and this charm can blind even intelligent people to monstrous deeds. The secretaries also revealed the power of compartmentalization. They worked in physical proximity to Hitler, but psychological distance from his crimes. They typed letters about military operations, but not orders for mass murder. They saw Hitler's rage against Jews in abstract terms, but not the concrete reality of death camps. This compartmentalization was partly imposed by the regime's information control and partly self-imposed by individuals who chose not to ask questions or seek information that would force moral reckoning. The gender dynamics of their testimonies also shocked contemporary audiences. These were educated, intelligent women who had nevertheless subordinated their moral judgment to a male authority figure. Feminist scholars have debated whether they should be viewed as victims of patriarchal manipulation or as morally autonomous agents who made culpable choices. The secretaries themselves often portrayed their wartime selves as naive and powerless, emphasizing youth, ignorance, and the social expectations that women not involve themselves in politics or question authority. The timing of their revelations also mattered enormously. Accounts given immediately after the war differed from those given decades later, as both the secretaries and their audiences had changed. Early accounts often minimized Nazi crimes and emphasized the secretaries' limited knowledge. Later accounts, particularly Junge's, showed more willingness to acknowledge moral failure, perhaps because enough time had passed to allow genuine reflection, or perhaps because changing social norms made earlier defenses untenable. The secretaries' descriptions of their colleagues and the broader staff around Hitler provided additional context. They described Martin Bormann, Hitler's party secretary, as crude and power-hungry. They portrayed Joseph Goebbels as intelligent but fanatical. They recounted Hermann Göring's fall from favor as his drug addiction and military failures became undeniable. These character sketches, while sometimes tinged with personal likes and dislikes, provided valuable insights into the personalities and power dynamics within Hitler's inner circle. The secretaries also revealed details about the extensive security apparatus that protected Hitler. They described the multiple rings of guards, the elaborate protocols for anyone seeking access to Hitler, the paranoid precautions against assassination. This security apparatus created both physical separation from the outside world and psychological isolation. Hitler and his immediate circle existed in a hermetically sealed environment where external reality was filtered through layers of control and ideology. The most shocking revelations from Hitler's secretaries concerned not grand historical events, but the mundane details of daily life in service to a dictator. These details illuminated what philosopher Hannah Arendt would famously call the banality of evil, the ordinariness of those who commit or enable extraordinary crimes. The secretary's accounts revealed Hitler as a man with quirks, preferences, and routines, someone who fussed over his diet and worried about his dog, even as he orchestrated genocide. The secretaries described Hitler's vegetarianism in detail, not because it was historically significant, but because it exemplified the cognitive dissonance at the heart of their experience. Here was a man who professed concern for animal welfare, who would not eat meat, who became upset when his dog was mistreated, yet who ordered the murder of millions of human beings. The secretaries seemed genuinely baffled by this contradiction, unable to reconcile the considerate boss who inquired about their health with the architect of the Holocaust. Traudl Junge described Hitler's evening tea sessions, which would often stretch past midnight. Hitler would hold forth on his favorite topics: art, architecture, his plans for rebuilding German cities after the war. He spoke about music, though he had little formal education in it. He reminisced about his youth in Vienna and Munich. He would occasionally ask his secretaries polite questions about their lives, but mostly preferred to monologue while his audience listened attentively. These sessions created an illusion of cultured domesticity, as if the bunker were simply a gentleman's club, rather than the command center for genocide. The secretaries revealed Hitler's hypochondria and his dependence on his physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, who administered a cocktail of medications including stimulants, vitamins, and substances whose exact nature remains debated by historians. They observed Hitler's physical deterioration, the trembling left hand that suggested Parkinson's disease, the stooped posture, the graying complexion. They witnessed his psychological decline, the paranoid rages against generals he believed had betrayed him, the delusional belief that secret weapons would still turn the war in Germany's favor, the disconnection from the reality of Germany's imminent defeat. Christa Schroeder provided details about Hitler's rigid dietary requirements and his fussiness about food preparation. He preferred simple Austrian dishes, disliked elaborate cuisine, and required his meals to be prepared by trusted staff. This pickiness about food, while millions starved in concentration camps or on battlefields, represented another jarring disconnect that the secretaries seemed unable to process morally. They reported these details as interesting personality quirks, rather than recognizing them as symptoms of a sociopathic self-absorption. The secretaries described Hitler's relationship with Eva Braun, which provided yet another disturbing insight into his capacity for compartmentalization. Braun attempted to maintain an atmosphere of normality, even in the bunker, organizing small social gatherings, ensuring that birthdays were celebrated, trying to preserve routines and rituals that created the illusion that life was normal. The secretaries witnessed the bizarre spectacle of Hitler marrying Braun just hours before their joint suicide, a gesture toward conventional morality from people who had violated every moral norm. What shocked audiences about these revelations was their very ordinariness. People expected accounts of Hitler to reveal obvious monstrosity, sadistic cruelty, megalomaniacal ravings, behavior that would clearly mark him as evil. Instead, the secretaries described a man who was often polite, who had predictable routines, who liked dogs and disliked smoking, who could be boring in his lengthy monologues about architecture. This ordinariness was disturbing because it suggested that great evil does not require obvious personal depravity, that mass murderers can be banal in their personal habits even as they orchestrate atrocity. The secretaries also revealed the surreal psychological atmosphere of the bunker in its final weeks. As Soviet forces closed in and the sounds of artillery grew louder, the bunker inhabitants maintained elaborate pretenses. They dressed for meals, observed social niceties, continued routines of correspondence and administrative work, even when such work had become meaningless. This ritualistic maintenance of normalcy amid apocalypse suggested massive collective denial, a group delusion that if they simply continued acting as if things were normal, perhaps the catastrophe engulfing them would somehow be averted. Traudl Junge described typing Hitler's political testament in the bunker's final days. Even as he prepared for death, Hitler blamed Jews for the war and urged Germans to continue the fight against international Jewry. Junge typed these words without apparent awareness of their horrific implications, later claiming she had been too focused on the technical task of accurate typing to process the content's meaning. This failure to engage critically with what she was typing shocked those who heard her testimony. How could an intelligent person transcribe such vicious anti-Semitism without moral reaction? The secretaries revealed Hitler's treatment of his dog, Blondie, including his decision to test cyanide capsules on the dog before using them for his own suicide. This detail encapsulated the moral inversion at the heart of Nazism, more concern for testing whether poison would work quickly on a dog than for the millions already murdered in death camps. Yet the secretaries recounted this incident as a sad detail about Hitler's final hours, rather than recognizing it as symptomatic of his warped moral universe. The mundane logistical details of bunker life also featured prominently in the secretaries' accounts. They described the ventilation system that struggled to clear cigarette smoke, the electric generator that sometimes failed, the shortage of fresh water in the final days. They recounted who slept in which rooms, who took meals together, the social hierarchies and personal tensions among bunker inhabitants. These details provided historians with valuable information about the bunker's layout and the Third Reich's final hours. But they also revealed the secretaries' focus on concrete, immediate concerns rather than moral or historical significance. The secretaries described their own emotional states during this period, revealing complex mixtures of fear, denial, and bizarre optimism. Some maintained hope that relief forces would reach Berlin. Others engaged in fatalistic gallows humor. Many focused obsessively on small tasks and routines as psychological survival mechanisms. Their accounts revealed how ordinary people cope with extraordinary circumstances through compartmentalization, denial, and focus on immediate concerns rather than broader moral or historical realities. What emerged from these accounts was a portrait of Hitler that challenged simplistic understandings of evil. He was neither the raving madman of Allied propaganda nor the superhuman genius that Nazi propaganda proclaimed. He was a deeply damaged individual with certain charismatic qualities, conventional tastes, and the capacity for personal kindness toward his immediate circle, who nevertheless ordered the murder of millions. This combination, personal ordinariness combined with historical enormity, disturbed audiences because it suggested that great evil can emerge from seemingly ordinary people in the right circumstances. The secretaries' revelations about the bunker's final days had particular historical importance. They provided eyewitness accounts of Hitler's last will and testament, his marriage to Eva Braun, his final conversations with remaining staff, and the circumstances of his suicide. These details helped establish historical facts that might otherwise have remained uncertain or subject to conspiracy theories. Yet even in providing this valuable historical information, the secretaries revealed their own limitations. They could describe what happened, but seemed unable or unwilling to reflect deeply on what it meant. The secretaries' descriptions of Hitler's final hours were particularly chilling. They recounted how he gave poison capsules to his secretaries as mementos, how he said farewell to his staff with apparent emotion, how he retreated to his private quarters with Eva Braun for the last time. They described hearing the gunshot that ended his life, the discovery of his body, and the hasty cremation in the Chancellery Garden as Soviet forces approached. These intimate details of history's most notorious suicide provided closure to Hitler's story, while simultaneously raising questions about how the secretaries could remain so devoted to him until the end. The contrast between the bunker's claustrophobic atmosphere and the apocalyptic destruction occurring above ground created a surreal dislocation that the secretaries struggled to convey. While Berlin burned and civilians suffered horrific casualties, the bunker inhabitants maintained their routines, typed their correspondence, and pretended that normalcy could be preserved through force of will. This disconnect between the protected world of the bunker and the catastrophe beyond its walls exemplified the broader disconnect that had characterized the entire Nazi regime. A leadership divorced from the consequences of their decisions, insulated by privilege and ideology from the suffering they caused. The secretaries also revealed the fate of other bunker inhabitants after Hitler's death. Some committed suicide, following their leader into death. Others attempted escape, with varying degrees of success. Still others simply waited to be captured, resigned to whatever fate the victors would impose. The Secretaries' accounts of these final hours, of watching their world literally collapse around them, provided human dimension to historical events, often rendered in abstract terms. The Secretaries' navigation of post-war Germany and their evolving testimonies reveal complex patterns of memory, denial, and selective truth-telling. Their experiences illuminated broader questions about how societies and individuals process participation in atrocity, and how testimony changes as both witnesses and their contexts evolve over time. In the immediate aftermath of Germany's surrender, Hitler's secretaries faced detention and interrogation by Allied forces. Authorities wanted to establish facts about Hitler's death, to gather intelligence about the Third Reich's final days, and to assess whether these women had knowledge of war crimes. The interrogations were often difficult, conducted in languages the secretaries struggled with, by interrogators who viewed them with suspicion and hostility. The power dynamics were reversed. Women who had been privileged members of Hitler's inner circle now found themselves prisoners dependent on the goodwill of victors. The secretaries quickly learned that their survival and freedom depended partly on what they revealed and how they presented themselves. They emphasized their subordinate positions, their limited access to information about crimes, their focus on purely administrative duties. They portrayed themselves as apolitical workers who happened to take dictation, rather than as committed Nazis or willing participants in a criminal regime. This self-presentation was partly strategic, minimizing culpability to avoid prosecution, and partly self-deceptive, a way of preserving psychological integrity by denying complicity. The emerging revelations about the Holocaust created particular challenges for the secretaries. As the full scope of Nazi crimes became public knowledge through the Nuremberg trials and widespread media coverage, claims of ignorance became harder to sustain. The secretaries had to navigate between maintaining their innocence and acknowledging what had become undeniable historical fact. Their responses varied. Some, like Junge, eventually admitted they should have known and could have found out, while others, like Schroeder, maintained defensive positions that increasingly strained credulity. The cultural context of post-war Germany shaped how the secretaries' testimonies were received. In the immediate post-war years, many Germans were focused on survival, finding food and shelter, locating missing relatives, rebuilding destroyed cities. There was limited appetite for extensive moral reckoning with Nazi crimes. As West Germany stabilized economically through the 1950s and integrated into Western alliances, a culture of silence about the Nazi past became widespread. In this environment, the secretaries found they could largely avoid public scrutiny by simply remaining quiet. The generational shift that began in the 1960s changed this dynamic. Young Germans born after the war began demanding that their parents' generation explain what they had done during the Nazi era. The 1968 student movements explicitly challenged the silence and denial that had characterized the 1950s. This created pressure for more honest accounting from those who had served the Nazi regime. Some secretaries, particularly older ones committed to their earlier narratives, simply refused to engage with these new demands. Others, particularly Junge, eventually responded with more honest reflection. The role of media in shaping public access to the secretaries' accounts was significant. Early accounts came through academic historians conducting research. Later, films and documentaries brought the secretaries' stories to wider audiences. The 2004 German film Downfall, which depicted Hitler's final days partly based on Traudl Junge's testimony, sparked intense debate about whether such portrayals humanized Hitler inappropriately or provided valuable historical insight. The controversy demonstrated ongoing tensions about how to represent Nazi perpetrators and their associates. The secretaries' accounts also revealed the malleability of memory and the ways that testimony evolves over time. Comparing early interrogation transcripts with later memoirs and interviews shows significant variations. Details added, emphasis shifted, interpretations changed. Some of these changes reflected genuine evolution in understanding as the secretaries aged and reflected on their experiences. Others suggested more troubling possibilities, that memories were being shaped by what witnesses believed audiences wanted to hear, or that defensive mechanisms were preventing honest recollection. The phenomenon of selective amnesia was particularly evident in the secretaries' accounts. They could remember minute details about Hitler's personal habits, what he ate, what films he watched, his dog's behavior, but claimed to remember little about conversations regarding Jews, military operations, or policies that would have revealed the regime's criminal nature. This selective memory was too convenient to be entirely credible, suggesting either active suppression of inconvenient memories or a willful refusal to have attended to such matters in the first place. Psychological research on memory and trauma helps contextualize some aspects of the secretary's testimonies. People who experience traumatic or morally compromising situations often unconsciously edit their memories to preserve psychological integrity. Details that would force acknowledgement of complicity may be genuinely forgotten or distorted in ways that minimize responsibility. Yet this psychological explanation, while illuminating, does not fully exonerate. The secretary's situations differed fundamentally from those of concentration camp survivors or other victims whose traumatic memories deserved different moral assessment. The secretary's relative privilege compared to other Germans also shaped their post-war experiences. Unlike millions of Germans who lost homes, family members, and communities, the secretaries generally survived the war physically unharmed. Unlike many Nazis who were prosecuted, imprisoned, or executed, the secretaries faced relatively minimal legal consequences. This privilege continued after the war. They could find work, maintain middle-class lives, and avoid the severe deprivations that characterized post-war Germany for many. This relative comfort may have reduced incentives for deep moral reflection that might have been prompted by genuine suffering. The gender dimensions of how the secretaries were treated and how they presented themselves continued into the post-war period. They benefited from assumptions that women were politically naive and morally passive, that they had simply followed orders without understanding their significance. These assumptions, rooted in sexist understandings of women's limited agency, provided cover that male associates of Hitler might not have enjoyed. Yet the secretaries also suffered from gendered dismissal. Their testimonies were sometimes discounted as gossip about personal matters rather than recognized as valuable historical evidence. The international context also influenced how the secretaries' revelations were received. During the Cold War, West Germany was an important ally against the Soviet Union, creating incentives to downplay Nazi crimes and move forward rather than dwelling on the past. This political context made thorough accountability difficult and provided space for former Nazis and their associates to rehabilitate themselves. The secretaries benefited from this broader pattern of limited accountability, able to live quietly without facing the moral reckoning that different political circumstances might have demanded. The philosophical questions raised by the secretaries' testimonies extended beyond their individual cases to broader questions about knowledge, responsibility, and complicity. How much must one know to be culpable? Is willful ignorance a form of complicity? Can following orders ever excuse participation in atrocity? The secretaries' various answers to these questions, some acknowledging that ignorance was culpable, others maintaining it as a defense, reflected the absence of consensus about these fundamental moral questions. The evolution of Holocaust education and remembrance culture influenced how later testimonies from the secretaries were framed and received. As the Holocaust became more thoroughly documented and memorialized, as survivor testimony became widely available, claims of ignorance from those close to Nazi leadership became increasingly implausible. The secretaries who lived into the era of comprehensive Holocaust education faced more skeptical audiences than those who gave accounts in the 1940s and 1950s. This changing context shaped both what they chose to reveal and how their revelations were interpreted. The secretaries' post-war lives varied considerably. Some married and raised families, keeping their wartime experiences private. Others struggled with guilt, depression, or the inability to form stable relationships. A few became minor celebrities, their association with Hitler conferring a morbid fascination that brought interview requests and book contracts. These varied trajectories reflected both individual personality differences and the contingencies of post-war circumstances, who they met, what opportunities emerged, how they processed their experiences psychologically. The question of what the secretaries owed to history, whether they had moral obligations to provide full testimony about what they witnessed, remains contentious. Some argued that their unique proximity to Hitler created special responsibilities to historical truth, that their silence or selective revelations constituted betrayals of history and memory. Others contended that they had rights to privacy and self-preservation like anyone else, that society could not demand complete honesty about experiences that might incriminate or psychologically devastate the witnesses. The Secretaries' relationships with other survivors of Hitler's inner circle also shaped their post-war testimonies. Some maintained friendships with former colleagues, creating social networks where their shared experiences could be discussed without judgment. These relationships sometimes reinforced defensive narratives. When everyone in one's social circle maintains similar stories about ignorance or limited responsibility, those stories become more psychologically sustainable. Others deliberately cut ties with their past, seeking fresh starts that required distancing from anyone who might remind them of their service to Hitler. The role of financial incentives in shaping what the Secretaries revealed deserves attention. Memoirs and interviews could be lucrative, creating monetary rewards for sharing testimony. This raised questions about whether financial motivations compromised the integrity of their accounts, whether they emphasized sensational details that would attract readers while downplaying information that might make them less sympathetic. The commercial market for Nazi-related materials created perverse incentives where being Hitler's secretary could become a source of income rather than shame. The revelations from Hitler's secretaries forced profound confrontations with questions about moral responsibility, the nature of complicity, and whether forgiveness is possible or appropriate for those who enabled atrocity. These questions had no simple answers, and the Secretary's various responses revealed the complexity of moral judgment in extreme circumstances. The concept of complicity itself requires careful analysis. The Secretaries did not personally murder anyone. They did not design death camps or command Einsatzgruppen, yet they enabled Hitler's work through their secretarial support. They benefited from their privileged positions, and they failed to resist or even question a regime committing genocide. This indirect participation raised questions about where lines of moral responsibility should be drawn. Are those who facilitate evil as culpable as those who directly commit it? The answer depends partly on knowledge. What did the Secretaries know, and when did they know it? The Secretaries' claims of ignorance about the Holocaust strained credibility for multiple reasons. They worked in close proximity to Hitler, who made his anti-Semitism explicit in countless speeches and writings they would have encountered. They typed correspondence and documents that, while perhaps not explicitly describing death camps, would have indicated systematic persecution of Jews. They lived in a society where Jews visibly disappeared from public life, where anti-Semitic propaganda was ubiquitous, where rumors and partial knowledge about mass killings circulated despite official secrecy. To claim complete ignorance required either extraordinary compartmentalization or deliberate evasion of available information. Traudl Junge's eventual acknowledgement that she could have and should have known represented a more honest reckoning than most perpetrator-adjacent figures achieved. Her admission that youth was no excuse demonstrated moral growth, a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. Yet even this belated honesty raised questions. Was genuine moral transformation possible after decades of denial? Could acknowledging guilt somehow compensate for years of service to evil? These questions had no satisfying answers, but Junge's willingness to confront them commanded a certain respect that her more defensive former colleagues never earned. Christa Schroeder's persistent defense of Hitler and refusal to acknowledge complicity represented a different moral trajectory. Her steadfast loyalty suggested either genuine delusion, a psychological inability to recognize Hitler's criminality, or stubborn ideological commitment that overrode moral reasoning. In either case, her position shocked those who believed that exposure to historical truth and the passage of time should lead to moral evolution. Schroeder demonstrated that some people remain impervious to evidence and resistant to moral reckoning regardless of circumstances. The question of forgiveness presented its own complexities. Who had standing to forgive the Secretaries? Not the millions murdered in the Holocaust. They could offer no forgiveness. Survivors and descendants of victims might extend forgiveness, but on what basis and with what meaning? German society might choose to move forward without demanding extensive accountability, but did this constitute forgiveness or merely pragmatic amnesia? The Secretaries themselves seemed uncertain whether they sought forgiveness or simply wanted to be left alone to live their lives. Philosophical frameworks for understanding complicity offer limited guidance. Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, developed partly from observing Adolf Eichmann's trial, suggested that great crimes can be committed by ordinary people following bureaucratic routines without deep ideological commitment or obvious personal depravity. The secretaries fit this pattern. They were not fanatic ideologues but ordinary women doing their jobs. Yet Arendt also emphasized that this ordinariness did not absolve responsibility. The secretaries' very normality made their complicity more disturbing, not less. The legal frameworks that emerged from Nuremberg established principles about superior orders not constituting a defense for war crimes. Yet these principles applied primarily to those who committed crimes, not to secretaries and support staff. The law offered limited guidance for assessing the moral responsibility of those who enabled crimes without directly committing them. This legal ambiguity left moral assessment to the court of public opinion and individual conscience. The psychological mechanisms that allowed the secretaries to serve Hitler without apparently experiencing moral crisis deserve careful analysis. Compartmentalization allowed them to separate Hitler, the courteous employer, from Hitler, the architect of genocide. Deference to authority, enhanced by both German cultural traditions and Nazi ideology, suppressed critical questioning. Social conformity made dissent or resistance psychologically difficult when everyone around them served the regime without apparent qualms. These mechanisms explain complicity without excusing it. Understanding how ordinary people come to enable evil does not make them less responsible. The role of ideology in shaping the secretaries' moral frameworks was significant but varied. None seem to have been ideological fanatics, but all absorbed Nazi ideas to varying degrees. Anti-Semitism, while perhaps not virulent in all cases, was present as background assumption. Nationalism, militarism, and authoritarian values shaped their worldviews. These ideological commitments made it easier to rationalize service to Hitler and harder to recognize the regime's criminality. Even those who eventually acknowledged complicity struggled to fully disentangle themselves from ideological frameworks that had shaped their understanding of the world. The question of whether the secretaries were victims themselves of manipulation, propaganda, limited information, generated controversy. Some argued that young women in a patriarchal, totalitarian society had limited agency and should be understood primarily as victims. Others contended that this framing minimized moral responsibility and created false equivalence between perpetrators or enablers and genuine victims. The truth likely lies between these extremes. The secretaries experienced real constraints on their agency while still retaining moral responsibility for their choices. The impact of the secretaries' revelations on collective German memory and identity was significant. Their testimonies provided concrete human faces to abstract questions about complicity and collaboration. Their various responses to moral reckoning, from Junge's eventual honesty to Schroeder's defensive denial, reflected broader patterns in how Germans processed the Nazi past. Their stories became part of ongoing debates about responsibility, remembrance, and how to prevent future atrocities. The comparative dimension also illuminates these questions. Other societies that have experienced genocide or totalitarian regimes face similar questions about complicity and accountability. The secretaries' testimonies can be compared to accounts from those who served other dictators or genocidal regimes. Common patterns emerge: claims of ignorance, emphasis on following orders, compartmentalization of moral concerns. These patterns suggest that the secretaries' responses were not unique to Nazism, but reflect broader human tendencies in extreme circumstances. The pedagogical value of the secretaries' testimonies lies partly in their moral complexity. Simple narratives about good versus evil offer limited educational value. The secretaries' stories force engagement with harder questions. How do ordinary people become complicit in atrocity? What are the limits of willful ignorance as a defense? How should societies balance justice with reconciliation? These questions remain relevant because the human tendencies that made the secretaries' complicity possible, conformity, compartmentalization, deference to authority, persist in all societies. The question of redemption also arises when considering the secretaries' post-war lives. Can people who enabled atrocity redeem themselves through later actions or acknowledgements? Junge's late-life honesty represented a form of redemption, though whether it sufficiently addressed her wartime complicity remains debatable. Others who never acknowledged responsibility foreclosed any possibility of redemption, dying with their denials intact. These varied outcomes suggest that redemption requires genuine confrontation with past wrongs, not merely the passage of time. The intergenerational impact of the Secretaries' choices extended beyond their own lives. Their children and grandchildren inherited complicated legacies, the knowledge that their mothers or grandmothers had served history's most notorious dictator. How these descendants processed this inheritance varied, with some seeking to understand and learn from it, while others preferred to maintain family silence. The Secretaries' choices about what to reveal or conceal about their experiences shaped not just historical understanding, but family narratives across generations. The revelations from Hitler's secretaries shocked the world not through dramatic disclosures of unknown crimes, but through mundane details that exposed the ordinariness of evil and the complexity of complicity. Their testimonies revealed Hitler as neither the raving madman of propaganda nor the superhuman figure of Nazi mythology, but as a deeply damaged individual with conventional tastes and personal quirks, who nevertheless orchestrated the murder of millions. This ordinariness disturbed audiences because it challenged simplistic notions about evil being always recognizable and repellent. The Secretaries themselves embodied contradictions that forced uncomfortable confrontations with questions about moral responsibility. They were simultaneously privileged insiders and subordinate employees, educated women and apparent moral naïfs, witnesses to history and participants in enabling atrocity. Their various post-war trajectories, from Junge's eventual acknowledgement of complicity to Schroeder's steadfast defense of Hitler, demonstrated that there was no single template for how individuals processed their roles in serving evil. What shocked the world most profoundly was perhaps not what the Secretaries revealed about Hitler, but what their testimonies exposed about human nature and the mechanisms of complicity. Intelligent people could work closely with a genocidal dictator and claim not to have known about genocide. Personal kindness, Hitler's solicitude toward his secretaries, could coexist with ordering mass murder. Ordinary women doing ordinary jobs could enable extraordinary crimes through simple bureaucratic competence, combined with willful ignorance. The Secretaries' revelations about life in Hitler's bunker illuminated the surreal disconnect between mundane routines and historical catastrophe. They described tea sessions and dietary concerns, social hierarchies and personal tensions, all unfolding as millions died in concentration camps and battlefields. This disconnect exemplified how compartmentalization and denial allow people to participate in or witness atrocity while maintaining psychological normalcy. The evolution of the Secretaries' testimonies over time revealed the malleability of memory and the influence of changing social contexts on what witnesses choose to reveal. Early post-war accounts minimized knowledge and emphasized limited agency. Later testimonies, particularly from Junge, showed more willingness to acknowledge moral failure as German society became more confrontational about the Nazi past. These changing narratives demonstrated that testimony is never purely objective, but is shaped by psychological needs, social contexts, and evolving self-understanding. The question of complicity, how to assess the moral responsibility of those who enabled crimes without directly committing them, received no definitive answer from the Secretaries' revelations. Their cases highlighted the inadequacy of simple categories like perpetrator and victim, the limitations of legal frameworks designed for direct criminality, and the complexity of moral judgment in extreme circumstances. They forced recognition that complicity exists on a spectrum and that those who facilitate evil bear responsibility even if that responsibility differs from that of direct perpetrators. The gendered dimensions of the Secretaries' experiences and testimonies revealed how patriarchal assumptions about women's limited agency could provide both oppression and protection. The Secretaries were constrained by social expectations that women not involve themselves in politics or question authority, yet they also benefited from assumptions that women were politically naive and morally passive. This complicated dynamic resisted simple feminist narratives, while demonstrating how gender shapes both participation in atrocity and subsequent accountability. The pedagogical legacy of the Secretaries' testimonies lies in their demonstration that ordinary people can enable extraordinary evil through combinations of ideological conditioning, social conformity, compartmentalization, and willful ignorance. Their stories serve as warnings about the human capacity for self-deception and the ease with which normal moral reasoning can be suspended when serving authority. They illustrate that proximity to evil does not guarantee its recognition, and that personal kindness does not preclude participation in atrocity. The Secretaries' various responses to moral reckoning after the war demonstrated that genuine self-examination and acknowledgement of complicity remain rare even among those who have witnessed their consequences firsthand. Traudl Junge's eventual honesty stood in stark contrast to Christa Schroeder's persistent defensiveness, showing that individuals facing identical circumstances can make radically different choices about confronting their pasts. These varied responses suggested that moral evolution is possible but not inevitable, that time alone does not guarantee wisdom or self-awareness. The historical value of the Secretaries' testimonies extended beyond their insights into Hitler's personality and final days. They provided crucial evidence about the Third Reich's inner workings, the psychological atmosphere in Nazi leadership circles, and the mechanisms through which totalitarian regimes maintain loyalty among staff. Their accounts helped historians understand not just what happened, but how it was possible for ordinary people to participate without apparent moral crisis. The question of whether the Secretaries should be forgiven remained unresolved and perhaps unresolvable. Forgiveness requires both genuine acknowledgement of wrongdoing and standing to grant absolution. The Secretaries varied in their willingness to acknowledge complicity, and the standing to forgive belonged primarily to victims who could no longer speak. What remained possible was understanding, recognition of the psychological and social mechanisms that enabled their complicity without excusing the choices they made. The revelations from Hitler's Secretaries ultimately shock because they force confrontation with uncomfortable truths about human nature and the conditions that enable atrocity. They demonstrate that education and intelligence offer no immunity to moral failure, that personal charm can coexist with monstrousness, that bureaucratic competence can facilitate genocide, and that willful ignorance constitutes a form of complicity. These lessons remain relevant because the human tendencies they reveal, conformity, compartmentalization, deference to authority, capacity for self-deception, persist in all societies and all eras. The Secretaries' testimonies serve as perpetual reminders that preventing future atrocities requires not just opposing obvious evil, but remaining vigilant against the ordinary mechanisms through which people become complicit. The small compromises, the questions not asked, the uncomfortable truths not acknowledged. Their stories shock not through dramatic revelations, but through mundane details that expose how easily ordinary people can enable extraordinary crimes when they choose bureaucratic efficiency over moral reasoning, personal loyalty over ethical obligation, and comfortable ignorance over difficult truth. In the end, what Hitler's Secretaries revealed after the war shocked the world not because it was unknown, but because it was undeniable. They provided eyewitness confirmation of what many suspected, that those who served Hitler were neither monsters nor dupes, but ordinary people who made choices, exercised agency within constraints, and bore responsibility for enabling one of history's greatest crimes. Their testimonies, for all their limitations and defensive evasions, contributed to historical understanding while simultaneously revealing the limits of that understanding. They showed us both what happened and how little some participants learned from their proximity to catastrophe. The ongoing resonance of their revelations demonstrates that the questions they raised remain unresolved. How do we judge those who enable evil without directly committing it? What knowledge and agency are necessary for moral culpability? Can acknowledgement of complicity achieved late in life compensate for decades of denial? How do societies balance accountability with reconciliation? The Secretaries provided no definitive answers to these questions, but their testimonies ensured that the questions themselves could not be forgotten or evaded. In this sense, their greatest contribution may be not what they revealed, but what they forced successive generations to continue questioning about complicity, conscience, and the human capacity for both evil and self-deception. The legacy of Hitler's Secretaries extends into contemporary discussions about collaboration, enablement, and moral responsibility in the face of authoritarian power. Their testimonies remain relevant not as historical curiosities, but as case studies in how ordinary individuals navigate extraordinary moral challenges, how societies process collective guilt, and how the human capacity for denial can persist even when confronted with overwhelming evidence. The shock their revelations produced was not momentary but enduring, continuing to disturb and educate each generation that encounters their stories anew.